Good evening. Welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, and answering your questions tonight, the Editor-in-Chief of Guardian Australia, Catherine Viner, Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg, musician and Pacific rights advocate David Bridie, who's best known for his band Not Drowning Waving, businesswoman and Chair of Manufacturing Australia, Sue Morfitt, and Shadow Communications Minister Jason Clare. Please welcome our panel. As usual, we're being simulcast on ABC News 24 and News Radio, and you can join the Twitter conversation or send us a question by using the Quanda hashtag that's just appeared on your screen. Our first question comes from Dan Cregan.
Political and business leaders often agree that certain financial institutions are too big to fail. Are there other Australian companies that are too big to fail, and is Qantas one of those companies?
Catherine Viner, is Qantas one of those companies?
Well, since the audience has arrived, there's been a big development actually in this story, which is Tony Abbott has announced that Qantas is going to have no debt guarantee, but the Qantas Sale Act is going to be lifted. The crucial parts of it, which mean that restrictions on foreign ownership are going to be gone, that any number of non-Australians can be on the board. The headquarters don't even need to be in Australia. It doesn't even need to be called Qantas anymore. This is if it gets through the Senate, so it's a big development today.
Josh Frydenberg, well, you perhaps better pick up from that. I mean, if Qantas is too big to fail, is it a good idea to allow all these things to happen? Might not even be Qantas in the future.
Well, firstly, it's a very important announcement by the Prime Minister. Essentially what he's trying to do is protect thousands of Australian jobs and to free up Qantas to survive and prosper as a 93-year-old Australian icon. You see, you have to understand, Tony, that Qantas is facing a number of strong headwinds. Firstly, it's competing against big Asian and Middle Eastern airlines. For example, Emirates only started in 1985 with one plane. It recently put an order in for 350 new planes with Qatar and Etihad. Virgin's been competing extremely aggressively. It's put 900,000 seats just last year, additional seats to win capacity. And of course, the input costs for Qantas have gone up dramatically, a $106 million bill on the carbon tax, and the legacy of trade union deals from some time ago mean that the wages costs for Qantas are 24% of its revenue compared to, for example, Cathay Pacific, where it's just 15%, and Singapore Airlines just 11%. So we've said drastic action is required. That drastic action is to, as Catherine said, to repeal Section 3 of the Qantas Sale Act.
If it needs to have drastic action for Qantas to survive, why not give it a debt guarantee, which is something you can do, rather than promise to put legislation through which may not, in fact probably won't, go through the Senate?
Well, we hope it's going to go through the Senate, and you know, there will be some of the independents who will support it. The reason why we haven't gone down
Which ones, by the way?
Well, let's just wait and see. Clive Palmer is not one of them, but you know, there are some others.
Well, that's two senators that he has
the one
there, and possibly an extra senator if the West Australian election goes the way you wouldn't want it to go.
The independent senator from South Australia, formerly of Family First, has said that he is in favour of lifting the Qantas Sale Act. But, you know, we need to take this action, and we also need to get rid of the carbon tax, which is a $106 million drag on Qantas. So, look, we're hoping this will provide an answer. The reason why, to answer your question, we haven't gone down the path of the debt guarantee is because if we offer it to Qantas, do we offer it to Virgin? Virgin has 8,000 Australian employees, Tony. Rex is also struggling at the moment. Do we offer it to Rex? It fulfils important regional routes.
Neither of those are national carriers, and so the criteria that Joe Hockey laid out a few weeks ago, when he seemed to be indicating a debt guarantee was on the cards, are not fulfilled by either of those airlines.
Well, I understand that the Cabinet had a very full discussion tonight. Every member spoke, and that's the decision they came to, and, you know, I think it's the right decision.
Let's hear from the other side of politics, Jason Clare. Now, I mean, Tony Abbott's put it back into Labor's court here. He said that if Labor wants to let Qantas bleed, it will not support this act to change majority ownership rules.
Well, Qantas is our national airline, and it should remain majority Australian-owned. That's Labor's view. The reforms that the Prime Minister's talked about this evening mean that the head office of Qantas could go overseas, could mean the board goes overseas, could mean all of the maintenance work goes overseas. And as Catherine said, you could even change the name Qantas.
Why would you do that, by the way? I mean, it's a pretty good brand. I mean, why would you get rid of a brand like Qantas?
Well, it'd be silly to change the name, and it's not smart either to send thousands of jobs overseas. We've been told last week that we're going to lose 5,000 Qantas jobs, and if this was to pass the Parliament, then thousands more maintenance jobs would go overseas, and that's why Labor will not support that.
And how do you see the numbers lying in the Senate? Because currently it wouldn't get through the Senate. The new reconfigured Senate may be different, or will it?
Well, it's too early to tell. We've got a by-election in WA as well. The point I want to make is that when Tony Abbott was in opposition, he said no to everything. We're prepared to take a constructive approach here. Whilst we say that Qantas must remain majority Australian-owned, we're happy to look at other provisions in Part 3 about 25% ownership by a single entity or 35% by a single airline. We think there's room to move there. We also think a debt guarantee that gives Qantas access to cheaper capital is an option that should be considered. But what we won't support is more jobs going overseas. I've got a friend of mine who's worked for Qantas for 40 years. He's 56. He's terrified at the moment at the prospect that he's one of the 5,000. If this went through Parliament, then there's more Qantas workers who could lose their jobs overseas.
Sue Morfitt, you ran a company where the jobs did go overseas. Do you think this is likely for Qantas? Is it the sort of thing that may need to happen?
It is difficult. I don't know what will happen with Qantas because you need to be in a business to understand exactly the decisions that they need to make. I think the most important thing is that Qantas is being able to be put on a level playing field. We can't bubble wrap our Australian icons under any circumstances. They need to have the opportunity to either be a national carrier and sponsored by the government like Air New Zealand is, or otherwise they need to be given a free rein and get on with being a competitive business. It is extremely difficult for any business to offshore jobs, but sometimes and I'm not suggesting that Qantas will need to do an enormous amount of that. It may have the opportunity to reverse and be strong, so we don't know that. But if you do need to do that, sometimes you might need to forgo some jobs in order to save so many more, and they're tough decisions that companies need to make.
The questioner asks, is it too big to fail? Is Qantas too big to fail? What's your view on that?
Well, I wouldn't like to think that it was going to fail. I think the Qantas brand is so strong, and I think that with the correct management and ownership structure that is able to be put in, I think that they should do a good job.
I'll go back to the questioner. When you ask the question about too big to fail, are you worried that governments think like that?
There's an element of moral hazard in that intervention. I'd be interested to hear the panel out on that aspect.
Yeah, Jason,
maybe just to add to that, Joe Hockey said a couple of weeks ago that he thought Qantas was a special case because if it did fail, it would have enormous impacts on the economy. He also made the point that it's more regulated than other airlines, and other airlines get access to cheaper capital than Qantas. And he was making a case there for a debt guarantee. He's now been rolled in Cabinet effectively. They're not going to do that. But you've got the Treasurer of the country there saying Qantas is a special case, and you only have to stop for a second and have a think about what would happen to Australia if Qantas wasn't there. It grounded its airlines only 2 years ago and it caused enormous chaos for a couple of days in Australia. If that was to happen...
I'd like to hear from the questioner. Would you be comfortable to see Qantas become a company which is not majority Australian-owned?
Fresh capital is required, and that's the only place it's going to come from. I'm open to that idea.
David Bridie, can I hear from you? We haven't heard from your position yet.
Musicians tend to fly Virgin because they give us better freight options. But, however, I did a film once out at, did the soundtrack of the film out at Longreach, and it's the birthplace of Qantas. It's called the Queensland and Northern Territory Air Service. It does strike me that letting Ford and Holden go a couple of weeks back, SPC, the national airline is something that we hold quite dear. Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu have their own national airlines.
Is it sort of, are you saying it's kind of emotional, or...?
I think it's a symbolic thing, yeah, very much so. And if the government is saying this, it's in some way saying that anything goes.
Can I just say, you know, we're dealing with a commercial airline and nobody wants to see Qantas fail. In fact, there is demand out there for it to survive and prosper. And I think Sue made the very important point that we're talking about creating a level playing field. This is we don't live in the world of government ownership anymore. Jason's own party was responsible for Qantas being taken out of government hands in the first place. You did the same with the Commonwealth Bank and we did the same with Telstra. There's a bipartisan approach to that. When the going gets tough commercially, you can't just put your hand up and say, as a government, well, look, we're going to go to the taxpayer and say, you need to subsidise this company.
We've got a taxpayer with a hand up in the audience there. We'll go to that gentleman there. Go ahead.
To the panel, I'm just wondering, it seems the conversation we keep having is the only way we can compete globally now is by cutting wages and conditions in Australia. And I'm trying to work out, is that the government policy? The only way forward is just to keep cutting wages and blaming workers of Australia?
It's absolutely not the policy. The policy is how do we lift productivity? Martin Ferguson, a sort of doyen of the Labor Party, said we can't live and operate in a world which is a global environment with falling productivity and higher wages. So something's got to give at that time. So what we do need is better cooperation between companies and also their workers, and we also need high productivity, and that's using new technology, investing in skills and investing in infrastructure.
I'll tell you what, we're going to come back to those questions about productivity and so on later in the programs. Just sticking with Qantas for the moment, would you be happy, as it was almost canvassed as a possibility in the Prime Minister's press conference, that the airline could be split up into an international carrier and a domestic carrier? We know the international carrier will struggle under circumstances like that because it's actually having trouble making a profit now.
Look, I wouldn't like to see that, but what I would like to see is...
But could that happen, and would you care if it did?
Well, we haven't changed the Air Navigation Act, which is the restriction of 49% on foreign ownership, which Virgin also has to live by currently. So Qantas, as an Australian-based airline operating internationally, would have to live by that existing Air Navigation Act. So it's possibly they could change their business structures, as you suggest. But, you know, the point here is the fundamental point, which is we want Qantas to survive. They've just announced a massive couple of $100 million loss. They've just announced 15% of their workforce going, 5,000, and they're coming now to the taxpayer and saying, can you guarantee our debt? And we've said as a government, if we do it for you, we have to do it for others. And these are tough times.
Why is that, by the way? That doesn't really make that much sense.
Well, John,
I mean, you can make, as a government, specific decisions related to a national carrier.
Sure.
So why can't you do that?
Because John Borghetti has just said, the minute, if you were to give a debt guarantee to Qantas, within 24 hours he'd be putting the same request on the desk of government. They employ 8,000 Australians. They also just released a loss. They also have a big carbon tax bill. You know, I don't think government should be getting into the business of picking winners. What government should be doing...
On the one hand, you're saying that particular airline is backed by giant countries spending huge fortunes, and on the other hand, you're saying they're going to be in trouble. If you give a debt guarantee to the company that doesn't have that advantage.
Look, they've got 8,000 Australian employees, they've got a loss, and, you know, they're trying to aggressively grab market share. I mean, Tony, Qantas is facing difficult times, and we're hoping that this change to the Qantas Sale Act, if passed by the Senate, will actually produce a more viable and prosperous
We've got another question from the floor. Go ahead.
You say that you want Qantas to survive, but that's the same thing you said about Holden, and the same thing you've said about SPC, and the same thing you've said about both Toyota and Ford. How is the government's policy on this issue to just let the free market handle it and hope for the best any different?
Well, in terms of... Well, the good news... thanks very much for that question. The good news is SPC is surviving. And it is...
Thanks to the Victorian government.
Thanks to the Victorian government, but also thanks... also thanks, Tony, to a parent company, Coca-Cola Amatil, which has just turned hundreds of millions of dollars loss.
Can I just make the point? I mean, it does actually strengthen the point made by the questioner, because in reality the federal government was prepared not to see that extra money go in that would have helped Coca-Cola Amatil, as they say, keep that company going.
But, you know, we made the decision that the company, in this case, could survive if Coca-Cola Amatil stood up. The issues of Toyota, Holden, Ford, they're much more complex. They've received huge subsidies from the taxpayers over many years. They're competing with very, in a tough operating environment. Those companies are also dealing with difficult employment situations. Those companies made the
Let's go back to our questioner there, Josh.
Sure.
Sorry to subvert down here, but how can you argue that, they're, dealing with difficult employment issues, when the government blamed the union for Toyota going overseas, yet, the unions and Toyota then come out and say very clearly that it wasn't the union's fault. And how can this same thing apply to then Toyota, to Qantas, when you're talking about Qantas having too high of a wage, when the average Qantas wage is only a little over $56,000?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Well, just a short answer and then we'll hear from others.
Short answer. On Toyota, weeks before their announcement, they were in the federal court trying to get a change to their enterprise agreement. They couldn't, and they were trying to do it with the unions. At the end of the day, it's about productivity. Look, wages are just one part of the factor. Higher energy input costs are another part. The high Australian dollar is another factor. There are lots of factors at play here, but wages has certainly been one of them.
Catherine, one of the factors at play here is going to be politics. We've talked a little bit about what the Senate might or might not do, but it does seem, in fact, this is putting off a decision to help Qantas because politics will get in the way.
It's really interesting. I mean, it's almost like Tony Abbott wants an unholy row by doing this because people are going to be absolutely furious. My sense is that Australians really value Qantas as a national icon, as a kind of Australian brand, an Australian identity, down to the kangaroo. And I think he clearly wants a fight.
David, let's hear from you on that, because you obviously have that view. Do you think that the Australian public will care one way or the other if they still have an airline that's called Qantas, that's taking people overseas, but just happens to be foreign-owned?
I think this one might be a bridge too far, yeah. It does also strike me that if we're relying on the Senate for such an important decision, some of the senators that we have there, the way they've been elected and what they represent, that perturbs me a little bit. There's kind of some odd parties that are holding the decision.
So, what do you think about the whole thing now being effectively going to be put in the hands of the Senate?
Difficult. Yeah. But I do think that eventually common sense must prevail because it's such a good brand. It's so powerful. It's so iconically linked with our nation. We need it to be commercially strong, so we need to give it its best shot.
But when you say common sense must prevail, do you mean by that there should be a debt guarantee because that's what you can do quicker to help it survive, or do you mean we should wait and see how the vagaries of politics work out?
I think we should wait until see how the vagaries of politics play out, which is an unusual thing to say for someone who's in business that wants things to be done quickly. But if we give a debt guarantee to one, we have to give it across the board, and I find that probably not appropriate.
Well, Tony, I disagree with that because I think Qantas is a special case. It's the national carrier. Virgin isn't. And Joe Hockey made a number of points recently why it is a special case and why you can isolate it. And to my mind, if the government can give $16 million to a chocolate factory in Tasmania, then why can't it go out of its way to help our national carrier?
Because that was during an election campaign.
That's exactly right.
Let's go to our next question. Go ahead, it's from Andrew Wilson.
Senator Stephen Conroy accused Lieutenant General Angus Campbell of being engaged in a political cover-up. He had no trouble issuing an apology to Mark Latham for a statement he denied making. So why isn't Senator Conroy man enough to apologise to General Campbell, and why does Mr Shorten keep him on?
Let's start with our non-politicians. Sue Morfitt, you've obviously watched the Conroy debacle, some would call it. What do you think?
I think, one, it was inappropriate. I think, two, that the military take their writing instructions from the government, and so therefore I think that we should respect that and recognise it, and I think that it was not his best moment.
David Bridie, I think you've got a brother in the military, haven't you?
Yeah, my older brother's over in Afghanistan at the moment. He'll be there for the next 12 months.
Was this like an extension, an insult extended out to all
he's
military?
going over there to help train Afghani military over there since the Australian troops have come back.
But how do you suppose he would regard this Conroy suggestion that the military are covering up?
His attitude would be that they're not above scrutiny, so that in the past, when mistakes have been made, when there's been bastardisation accusations at Duntroon, the sex tapes, misuse of that military power that scrutiny is required, and scrutiny makes the military better. They're not above being accused. But it strikes me in this case that the issue is that the Lieutenant General is being called account. It's quite a politicised question. He's being made to act out the Stop the Boats issue, which is a very political exercise. So he does need to be held to account, I think.
Josh Frydenberg.
Well, David's absolutely right. The military are not above scrutiny. In fact, they face a lot of scrutiny. And my starting position here is no political party, Jason's or mine, has a monopoly on patriotism. Just like when it comes to the boats issue, none of us have a monopoly on compassion. But what concerned me and my colleagues about this issue with Senator Conroy was it was a premeditated attack. He was actually counselled by some of his colleagues before the Senate estimates hearing, do not go down this path. He went down that path and then he failed to apologise. And that is just compounding the hurt. And, you know, I don't know what Senator Conroy was thinking, because obviously, as Shadow Defence Minister, he has a special responsibility. In fact, a Labor former Shadow Treasurer here in New South Wales, Michael Costa, said yesterday, he has no credibility, Senator Conroy, and now his position is untenable. Now, that's coming from a Labor former State Treasurer saying that. So I think Senator Conroy has a lot to answer for, and Bill Shorten, as his leader, needs to assert his leadership and pull him into line.
Jason Clare.
I think what Stephen said was wrong. I know...
Should he apologise?
Well, that's a matter for him. He's withdrawn. That'd be a matter for him.
Would you like to see him apologise?
I know the Major General very well because I was a Defence Minister for 2 years, and I think that he's a good man, a man that I respect enormously. I don't think that he's engaged in a political cover-up at all. I do think that the unnecessary secrecy around Operation Sovereign Borders has put him in an awful position. We know less about what is going on in the seas off Australia than, for example, we know has happened in Afghanistan. John Curtin told us more about what was happening on the Kokoda Track than we're being told now about what's happening north of Australia. So if there was less secrecy, I think we'd be able to address this in a mature fashion, but the way Stephen went about it was the wrong way.
So you blame the government but not the military?
Well, I agree with Josh that the military are not above criticism and they're not above investigation.
So is there a widespread view among Labor MPs that the military should not be in this role?
No. Let me put it this way. Tony, I was Minister for Home Affairs for 2 years. Through all of that time, no one in uniform ever said to me, we shouldn't provide information on what's happening with border protection. Never once was I ever told that this information would help people smugglers. And yet now suddenly we're told that it is. And it's very clear to me that this is a political edict, that we should not provide any information to the public, and the premise should be that it's going to help people smugglers. Now that is nonsense. I know it's nonsense because no one in the military ever told me that this was necessary to stop the boats.
Catherine Viner, what do you think?
I'd agree with that. I think there's a crazy amount of secrecy. It's just quite naive in the modern world when everyone's got mobile phones and Facebook accounts and we've got good journalists trying to find out what's really happening. But
they can't, because they can't go there.
Yeah, well, it's hard to go there, but when we do get stories, we get them through these other methods. But I think the government's sort of using the military to sort of shield themselves and what it's doing. Those questions should have been for Minister Morrison. They shouldn't have been for the General.
Josh, you want to respond to that?
Well, he's absolutely involved in the approach that the military and the government are taking to this issue. So it's appropriate that he faces a Senate estimates. And to Jason's point about how this information, he was never told that this information would be helpful to people smugglers if it was released. In fact, that's what Major General Campbell himself has said at the Senate estimates. You do not want that information to be handed out to people smugglers. You do not want to jeopardise operations. You do not want them to know what the Navy is effectively doing to to prevent these boat arrivals. Okay. So that's from him. That's from the General himself.
All right, let's go to our next questioner, which is on a related subject, and the questioner is Paige Burton.
Following the riot on Manus Island, the government's announced a review into violence on offshore centres. Does this lack of urgency reflect the government's indifference to human rights abuses, or is it an effective way to make sure some action is finally taken?
Well, it's completely unacceptable what happened there in Manus. I mean, Reza Barati, a 24-year-old Iranian, tragically lost his life, and as you say, there is a review being undertaken within the department. There's a coronial inquiry, there's a police investigation. There was, issues in terms of getting the right information when Scott Morrison first went public with it. But the point is, Manus was a policy that the Labor Party also subscribed to when they were in government.
Okay, I'm sure we'll get to that point.
Sure.
Stick with the murder, or the killing, I should say, of this young 23-year-old asylum seeker, Reza Barati.
Yeah.
Is that a homicide investigation now?
Well, it's a coronial. I understand there's a coronial inquest and there's a police investigation. But
it may, if some accounts are to be believed, it could well be the police who are involved in the death. So could they really be responsible for investigating?
Well, I mean, if the evidence is there, whoever did this should be punished, unequivocally.
But is it the responsibility of the Australian government to investigate the death of someone in their care?
Well, there's a police investigation being taken place by the PNG police, but we're obviously fully engaged. The other point to mention,
But shouldn't there be Australian homicide detectives, AFP detectives on the ground investigating this killing?
Well, that might be your view. Scott Morrison...
Should there be? I'm asking you.
Well, Scott Morrison was recently in Papua New Guinea, just came back, I think, 2 days ago. I don't know the exact nature of those discussions, but certainly ensuring that there's not a repeat of that violence in Manus, and that's taking into account the departmental review, taking into account the coronial inquiry, taking into account the police inquiry, trying to get to the bottom of it to ensure nothing like this happens.
Well, I'll just make the point, because the review says any evidence of criminal activity obtained by the review will be handed to the relevant authorities, that being presumably the PNG police.
Presumably, you're right.
Who may be investigating their own officers.
Well, just like we've investigated our own officers.
Okay, if that's the situation, let me ask David Bridie, because you've been to Manus Island many times. What do you think about this?
Well, the mobile police squad, who early reports are saying are responsible for this killing, they're paid for by the Australian government, but their job is to protect a private company, which is G4S, that they protect the perimeter of the detention centre in Manus. So you have to ask who is going to take responsibility, because it falls between the gaps. And there's been a lot of, throughout this whole issue up at Manus Island, there's been a lot of saying, well, no, that's the Papua New Guinean government's responsibility. No, that's the Australian government's responsibility. No, that's the private company's responsibility. So actually getting to the germ of what the problem here is not necessarily that easy. But the mobile police squad, they're like the goon squad up there. They were sent in at Bougainville to do a lot of the dirty work, to raise villages to the ground. They're also at the same up in the highlands of PNG to protect the company LNG PNG, to if there's landowners who are getting a bit uppity. In Port Moresby, there was a settlement that the government was concerned about because of a whole lot of criminal activity going there, and it was the mobile police squad that went in that raised this settlement to the ground.
These are allegations, I should add. I don't know if any of this has been absolutely proven, is that right?
I've never met anyone in PNG who's refuted this. They're not the military, they're not the police force. In fact, the police and the military in Papua New Guinea dislike the mobile police.
Is it your understanding that they are the ones investigating this killing? Does anyone know the answer to that?
I think they're the people who I think they're the lot who are responsible for it. Yeah.
Let me ask, I'll just quickly go back to Josh Frydenberg, because there are three versions of how this man was killed. Stomped to death on the ground, head stoved in by a riot shield, or beaten across the head with a length of timber. By the way, that's News Limited reporting. No, I'm simply making the point that that is a pretty... the sort of account that you would have to say your government would take seriously.
Absolutely.
So do you know who's actually investigating the killing?
Well, as I said, there's 3 levels of investigation that are currently going on, and they haven't fully completed. And one is the coronial, one is the police, and one is a serious departmental review. So I'm sure when that is those inquiries have played out, you've got to understand it's in the government's interest, Tony, for this not to happen again, right? We do not want to see a young man lose his life when he is in a detention facility, as David said, that we have paid for.
So close it down. Close it down.
Well, if we close it down,
I'll just pause there because we'll come back to that issue. I just want to hear from Jason Clare on this.
Anything in particular, Tony?
Well, yes, the issue of whether the review is appropriate and whether the investigation of that man's death is appropriate, the way it's been conducted.
Well, it needs to be full and it needs to be independent. Someone's died in Australia's care and control, and so it's very important that the investigation determines how the person died and who was responsible for it. And so, number one, it needs to be comprehensive. It needs to get to the truth. It may require a parliamentary inquiry as well. But I'm glad that the government has agreed to an inquiry. We need to make sure that we stop people drowning at sea, and we need to make sure that people are safe when they're in Australian care and control.
OK, we've got a video question. Anyone with their hands up? No, I can't see anyone. We've got a video question again on this subject, a slightly broader question. It's from Brian Davies in Uroomba, New South Wales.
It's been revealed that Manus Island detainees have no possibility of being resettled anywhere, as the PNG government has no plans or legislation for their resettlement. Indefinite detention without charge or trial is illegal under the PNG Constitution. Our High Court ruling on offshore detention made clear that any place designated by the Minister must have the capability for resettlement. If the Gulag is illegal under both PNG and Australian law, then why is it still open?
Let's start with David Bridie. Do you have any idea what the Papua New Guinea government is likely to do about resettlement? Because you wrote an article just a few days ago suggesting that they will not resettle any of these people in Papua New Guinea.
When the Papua New Guinean Prime Minister Peter O'Neill first signed on for this, he signed on for a regional processing centre. That Papua New Guinea would help their good allies, Australia, out by allowing the detention centre to be placed at Manus Island, which is an old Australian naval base. It used to be called Lombrum. And that they would be in for the processing only. I don't think they bought into settlement. And Papua New Guinea is not a country that has a history of people being settled, of migration. It's, even though there's nearly 900 language groups there, apart from the Chinese who have been there since the late 19th century, there are no other ethnic groups there. It's not a place where you wake up on a Saturday morning and there's, rental properties in the Post-Courier newspaper, or there isn't jobs. All the land's it's customary owned. It has strange services as it is. I can't imagine how a group of Tamils, Iranians, Iraqis and Afghanis would settle in Port Moresby, certainly not on Lorengau where Manus Island is, because it's a very small place. So I can't imagine that Papua New Guinea would be buying into this. There's also there's domestic opposition politically, but I don't think Papua New Guinean people, even though they're quite, they're very generous people, they're warm-spirited, but it just doesn't make sense that this would happen.
I'll just go to Jason Clare first. It was your government's idea to actually resettle asylum seekers in Papua New Guinea. What if it doesn't happen? What if the Prime Minister says, well, we've seen this, we've looked at it, we no longer want to do that?
Well, the agreement's for 12 months. It ends in July, and that agreement does say that people that are found to be refugees would be settled in PNG. So that's the expectation, and to be supported and helped by the Australian government, providing housing and education and health services. So that's the model. Two next-door neighbours helping each other. We've got a problem with people dying to get to the best country in the world, and they've got problems with law and order and education and
so
health.
Just can I work out how that happens? So the Australian government will provide educational, health, etc. services to a small group of people living within Papua New Guinea, but not to other Papua New Guineans?
Well, it's broader than that, Tony, because we're building a new hospital in Lae. David made the point about Port Moresby. I don't think there's an expectation, there certainly wasn't when we were in government, that people would be settled in Moresby, but potentially in other parts of the country. And there's flexibility in the agreement to provide specific services for the people who are resettled in PNG, but broader services for the community as well. So, for example, at the moment, the AFP is providing an extra 50 police to assist in PNG.
I agree. I totally agree with what Jason just said there, because...
Well, this is the problem.
Because this is a broader package that has been put to Papua New Guinea and to Peter O'Neill, who does want to see higher living standards for his people, and one of the ways to do that is to get the support of the Australian government. So hundreds of millions of dollars is flowing, and they are helping us in dealing with this issue.
Have you workshopped the hypothetical case where the Papua New Guinea government, under pressure from their own people and other politicians, say, no, we're not going to do this anymore?
Well, as I said...
What happens then?
Well, as I said, Scott Morrison just came back, and they've agreed now to meet at a ministerial level on a monthly basis with the specific purpose of accelerating the processing and, of course, the resettlement.
But these people are in legal limbo. It's just not going to happen. There's no sense of when they're going to be resettled, where they're going to be resettled, if Australia can guarantee their safety. It's like this bloodless conversation that we're having, which is an incredibly cruel system, completely inhumane. It's like this sort of Guantanamo for refugees because no one knows what's going to happen to them. It's a horrendous situation, and I think there must be a way of stopping drownings at sea that doesn't involve Australia becoming this kind of globally infamous human rights abuser.
Can I just respond?
Yeah, well, actually, yeah, you can. I want to hear from other non-politicians. Sue Morton.
I actually agree. I think it's very difficult. We're dealing with people who have come from traumatic environments. They can't always find the right or the correct way to get here. They take enormous risks with themselves, for their own lives, and with their children and their other members of their family, and they're being picked up and treated as if they're just sacks of potatoes, and it's absolutely unfair. It's unfair on the people that we're looking after, and it's very unfair on the population of Australia to think that that's how we would care for people who are not able to care for themselves as well as we would like.
Let me ask you this, because you'd be considered, I think, politically conservative. Do you think both sides of politics have... Do you think both sides of politics have behaved badly in this?
I truly think this is something that should be solved without politics. I think this is one of the few things... I mean, look, we need a strong political system. We need two different points of view. But this is one thing where we're talking about so many people's lives and so many people's futures that we should be able to solve on an apolitical basis.
Tony, can I just say, when we are talking about so many people's lives, I mean, let's not forget 1,200 people died at sea trying to get here.
Of course,
right now. So what we had to do was to take drastic action, and that drastic action received, was a mandate that we received at the election, and it's a three-party. This is a three-part process, and the offshore processing is part of it. Now, if you go back to the end of 2007 and the system that we handed over to the Labor Party, there were very few, less than half a dozen people in detention. Effectively, the boats had stopped coming, and that's because we had a deterrent in place. And as a result, broader public support for our immigration system and for our relatively generous offshore resettlement system went ahead, and the people in the broader Australian public supported it. What they didn't support was what has happened over the last 5.5 years, which was the 50,000 unauthorised arrivals, which was the 1,200 lives lost at sea, and which was the $11 billion blowout.
I think if they knew what was happening on Manus, I don't think they'd be supporting it.
I'm going to draw a line under it there because we've got other questions to get to. It's time to move along. You're watching Q&A. Our next question tonight comes from Mehmed Hasic.
This is a question for Sue Morford. When you were CEO of Pacific Brands, you made some tough decisions and closed several clothing factories, leaving nearly 2,000 workers without jobs. How do you now see the future of manufacturing in Australia, and what are your thoughts on government assistance to keep the manufacturing sector viable?
Right, complex question. In the first instance, to put off people because you need to change the structure of a company is an extremely difficult thing to do, and we had a company that was highly geared and highly valued at the peak of a cycle, and as the GFC hit and circumstances changed and values dropped, we had to make quite dramatic decisions in order to keep banks supporting our company and to keep our company alive. Which indeed we did. And to lose a lot of people from your your business is very difficult, not only for the people who go, but very difficult for the people who are staying. So I think that if anyone thinks that that's an easy way out to solve problems, I think that they would be most
do you feel, when you see Holden and Toyota and now Qantas laying off large numbers of people, many other industries as well, do you sort of think, well, that's what capitalism is really? It's kind of creative destruction.
No, I don't. I think that we should be able to and can run really good businesses and really strong businesses. It's just that the business world goes through cycles, it goes through transformation, it goes through change. And we need to be strong enough as leaders of businesses to identify what those changes are and then be able to manage our companies accordingly. We would all like to think that we were able to train the people that are on site with us to be able to take on the next phase of business's future. If those decisions aren't made early enough, you have no choice. You have to be quite radical. And it's not the way you would prefer to go. There are some industries that once were good and once were strong, like the clothing and textile industries that I worked in, that are now the strengths of developing nations. And so we buy from there, versus our nation now has opportunities to do different things. Look, first of all, Manufacturing Australia doesn't really support protectionism. As a matter of fact, we don't support protectionism at all. We think that we need the government to give us strong policies that enable us to flourish.
Let's focus on the strong policies. How big a factor is industrial relations reform from your point of view?
Oh, it's a very big factor.
And what fundamentally needs to change?
We need to have flexibility in the workforce, in relationships with our workforce. We need to be able to have direct engagement so that we can work on agreements with our employers and employees so that they can quickly decide what is good for them versus having third-party intervention. The other thing that we need is that we need the ability to reduce red tape, which we know.
Before you go on to red tape, stick with industrial relations for a moment, because one of the big issues is around penalty rates at the moment. I mean, does your association have a view on the kind of wages and conditions, penalty rates and other conditions that apply to workplaces?
Look, it's not so much the wages, and I have to be perfectly honest about it. It's not the wages, it's all the other things that take the time in going through negotiations with our workforces to be able to be expedient and set up new factories and so forth. It takes... one of our members had to take a factory offshore that they planned to do in Australia, spend $700 million building a fertiliser plant in Newcastle. They chose to build the fertiliser plant in America. It took them 6 months to get all their approvals through in the US. It takes up to 2 years or more to get the approvals through in Australia. It's that sort of thing that costs us money. It's not the wages, it's the nonsense that goes on around the people that
So no problem with penalty rates, no problem with conditions in the workplace?
Sometimes there are. I mean, in all varying sectors there are going to be problems, there are going to be some things. Some people are paid too much, some people are paid too little. I mean, that's our job as employers and it's our job as colleagues to understand what's fair and what's not fair.
Jason Clare.
Well, as somebody who worked for 5 years washing dishes and serving people at Sizzler at Carramar, I think penalty rates are pretty important. And we wouldn't support them going. Our industrial relations laws need to be fair and balanced, and that's where the debate will always exist. We don't want to go back to what happened 6 years ago where 1 million Australians had their wages cut under work choices. We can't allow that to happen, but there'll always be reviewed to make sure that they're right for the times. The other things that are going to make the manufacturing industry more competitive are a greater investment in skills, more investment in infrastructure and R&D. They're the sorts of things that are going to make sure that we've still got hundreds of thousands of people making things. There's almost 1 million Australians who work in manufacturing. As a proportion of the economy, that's going to reduce over time, but it's still going to be very important. It'll be niche manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, and we need to look at what government can do that sets the right environment for those businesses to thrive.
Now, before I'm actually going to go, we've got another question on this from Graham Sheether. Thank you, Tony. Graham's down here. We'll just get a microphone to you, Graham. Just hang on for 1 second. It's related to the issue we're talking about, and then we'll bring in the other panellists. Go ahead, Graham.
Okay. The current challenge for Australian manufacturing is to transform from old systems and products to advanced manufacturing. President Obama recently announced a $320 million grant to set up top-of-the-line digital technology manufacturing hub in Chicago to make USA manufacturing world competitive based on high-tech, qualified staff and industry partners, rather than transforming low-tech employees from old manufacturing industries. What are Australian government, industry bodies and small to medium enterprises doing to match this USA initiative?
I'll start with Josh Frydenberg, because the question really is, what can governments do, and do they have a rightful role in this space?
Yeah, well, to that point about advanced manufacturing, there are some fantastic Australian stories going on right now. So we shouldn't be down on our manufacturing sector because we've seen the troubles in Toyota and Holden and so forth. So, for example, the Bushmaster military vehicle that's made in Bendigo employs more than 250 people. It's now produced over 1,000 units. It's now being exported to Japan and Indonesia. Our pharmaceutical sector, we now export more from Australia, $4 billion plus a year, more than we do wine. And, you know, we've got some great Australian stories in our pharmaceutical sector, you know, like CSL and others. What we can do for them is the deregulation issue, is the tax issue, is the IR issue, but it's also the free trade agreements, because we are living in the most dynamic region of the world. There are going to be 3 billion people in the middle class in the Asia Pacific by 2030. They all want the things that we take for granted. You know, tourism, our education, our agriculture, and also our goods. So we've just signed this FTA with South Korea, which we believe, and it's been confirmed, that it's going to produce up to a $5 billion annual dividend for the Australian economy. It's going to give our manufacturers, our advanced manufacturers, an opportunity to get into the Korean market. We hope to replicate that in Japan and indeed with China. They're the stories that will make more jobs created here in Australia, and they're the stories that play to our strengths.
Okay, I'm just going to go back to our question. You obviously have cited a case of government involvement, the Obama government getting directly involved. What do you think about what you're hearing?
It's taking too long. The evidence from research and consulting is that the number of examples you've cited are too few. We're going to have something like 9,000 people moved out of the automobile industry that are really low-tech, expert in certain areas, but they're not going to be able to transform into the high-tech area that is required to really make Australian SMEs world competitive. We talk about going into...
Okay, all right, we need to get you to wind up that very interesting comment, but let me hear from Sue Morford first. Is there a role for governments in this, or should businesses be left on their own with no red tape and so on?
There is a real role for governments, and the role is that we need... There's 4 key things that the government can do to improve the opportunities for manufacturers. First of all, I do have to say that innovation actually happens in old companies as well as in new. We could do with hubs, but we also need to encourage the innovation that currently goes on in the companies that we have, and in small businesses, medium businesses and large businesses. But there are 4 key things that the government could do that would mean that we would have a more robust manufacturing sector, and almost to the point where we should be able to say that we have got a manufacturing sector that will actually grow.
I'm going to have to get you to make those 4 points very quickly. 4 points very quickly. We need an energy policy. We're giving away our gas to export without taking into account any of the needs of our Australian manufacturers or indeed households. We need to improve on our red tape. We need to reduce the red tape, which Josh is doing. We need to make sure that free trade is fair trade, which is what Jason's been working on, and we need to ensure that we have a strong, flexible IR regime. Those things, manufacturing will be very strong. All right, and I'll just get you quickly to respond to that. I mean, there are 4 things there. I mean, the energy policy is an interesting one, because that's a suggestion the government should step in and actually regulate the exporting of gas, keeping some of it in Australia for our own manufacturers.
Well, look, there's many questions questions on the energy policy because we're exporting so much of our gas, and our competitors and friends in the United States are going through a shale gas revolution where they're getting this cheap energy which is fueling their manufacturing base. So it's not a level playing field. But in terms of deregulation, I'm absolutely focused on this with the government. We're going to have our first repeal day in just a couple of weeks, and we're going to try to remove a lot of the red tape which is stifling our manufacturers, our businesses, and may I say also our not-for-profit sector.
OK, we're nearly running out of time, but we do have a question from Jeff Prenter. It's on a totally different subject, but let's hear from you.
Minister, sometime last year, a time I think best forgotten.
I think you mean former minister.
Yeah. You were Minister for Justice, and you declared this is the blackest day in Australia's sporting history. You were referring to a tsunami of drug abuse, gambling, rorting, and all kinds of skullduggery. From where I sit, and I think the rest of the population sit, so you're either colourblind or the blackest day claim was made without one skerrick of foundation.
Jason Clare.
Well, thank you very much for the question. First, I didn't say that. Somebody else said that, but I did release a report that was prepared by the Australian Crime Commission. It was a 12-month investigation, and it found serious things. It found that organised crime, the sort of organised criminals that import illegal drugs, were also importing peptides and other performance-enhancing drugs, and they found evidence that they were being used by professional sports people. So I was given the report, and I was told by the Crime Commission that they wanted to release it, and I backed them. I look back on the words I used that day, and everything that I said was correct. But we're talking here about some drugs that haven't been approved for human use, and in one case, a drug where somebody died in the London Marathon. So it's very serious. No one wants our professional sports people to be using performance-enhancing drugs, and it's been talked about in the shadows for a very long time. I think that it's time to get it out in the open and we need to fix it.
You know, the Prime Minister hopped into this today and said you blackened the name of the sport with your over-dramatic press conference.
Well, as I said, look back at what I said, and everything that I said was
you
true.
didn't. I know you didn't use the blackest day quote. That was someone else. But do you think your press conference was over-dramatic? It did give the sense that in every sport that you mentioned that huge numbers of people were going to be eventually found guilty of doing really bad things, and very few have.
We had the problem on the day, we had the limitation on the day that we couldn't identify the sports. Under the law that the Crime Commission has, the sports themselves have to identify it. So that was a restriction on us. But we shouldn't underestimate how serious this is. Assad has concluded their investigation. We'll know more over the course of the next few weeks and the next few months. But if putting out this report, closing down some of the places that were providing these drugs and getting messages to players has stopped one person from getting into trouble, has stopped one person from dying, then it's the right thing to do.
We haven't got much time. I'm quickly going to go back to our question. Are you the same Jeff Prenter that founded Rugby League Week, by any chance?
You've got it, Tony, yes.
Yeah, so...
I'm just curious about all these gambling rorts. Where are these gambling rorts in sport in Australia?
There wasn't any... Well, there was one example of that in the report. The report was really focused on performance-enhancing drugs rather than gambling in sport.
All right, look, I'm sorry that we're going to have to wind it up there. We'd quite like to hear from other players on the panel, but that is all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel. Catherine Viner, Josh Frydenberg, David Bridie, Sue Morford, and Jason Clare. And David, that is your cue. Thank you very much. Next Monday, we'll be joined by the Attorney-General and Minister for the Arts, Senator George Brandis, Shadow Treasurer Chris Bowen, the Australian's newly appointed media editor, Shari Markson, and comedian Wendy Harmer. And we'll leave you tonight with David Bridie's song Treason, his response to the idea that support for asylum seekers is un-Australian. Joining him on stage are Amanda Brown, Leah Flanagan, Dave Foley and Thomas Rann. Until next week's Q&A, good night.
Place sacred words side by side. Should you seek comfort, hide. You'll find your way eventually. Come climb aboard, sail with me. The brave ones fled on a pea green boat. Set fire to them, ignore them, and see if they'll float. We could avoid this catastrophe. Come dream a little dream with me. Has it all come to treason? Has it all come to treason now? To treason. Be not afraid, we're full of noise. With a prayer book war, some reckless cause. If you allow for divine grace, just stand your ground and we'll come and meet you face to face. Has it all come to treason? Has it all come to treason now? Has it all come to treason now? Has it all come to treason now?
Next, catch the day's news on Lateline, then The Business with host Tiki Fullerton, and later, D. Ellen Pascoe.
We all get knocked down, but it's how you get up.
The boxing fairy tale, from prison to fighting for the heavyweight championship of the world.
Anything is possible.
That's tomorrow night, 7:30.
Every woman carries a dream in her heart. To be something big, to be something extraordinary. But in some parts of the world, those dreams may never come true. To mark International Women's Day, ABC2 presents a compelling documentary double.
You've already failed. You're worthless.
We need to value women in this country equally.
Celebrate the women in your world. Wednesday from 8:35 on ABC2. Join ABC TV's Annabelle Crabb for Season 3 of Kitchen Cabinet as she invades the kitchens of some of our most engaging politicians. Crazy. Available now on DVD from ABC Shops and ABC Shop Online.
Richard Hammond is a man with a big plan to find out how on earth you build a planet that's just right for life.
What happened on the early Earth?
In the spectacular two-part series,
I'm ready.
He'll attempt to unravel the workings of the universe the only way he knows how.
Shooters, fire! That was quite exhilarating, I'll be honest. Do I look faintly ridiculous?
Richard Hammond Builds a Planet. Sunday, 7:30, ABC1.
Tonight, Qantas ownership up in the air. The Abbott government moves to lift foreign investment restrictions on Australia's national
Removing
airline.
the shackles on Qantas and allowing it to compete on a level playing field is the best guarantee for the workers. It is the best guarantee for the sustainability of Qantas as both a domestic and an international airline.
But the opposition sounds a warning on jobs.
Qantas have said that changing the Sales Act isn't going to help their issues in the short term, in the medium term. So the Abbott government should get out of the way, stop playing games and stop the hemorrhaging of thousands of jobs and seeing Australia's national icon and jobs exported overseas.
Good evening, welcome to Late Line. I'm Emma Alberici. Russia has taken control of Crimea, the southern region of Ukraine. No shots have been fired, but more than 15,000 troops are said to have invaded the country, taking over airports and government buildings. The new leadership in Kiev are calling it a declaration of war, but the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says his country is just protecting ethnic Russians living in Ukraine. Shortly we'll cross to Kiev and London for analysis of the crisis as the United States and Europe start to weigh possible responses. You can join the conversation on Twitter with our guest tweeter Richard Glover, the presenter of Drive on ABC Local Radio in Sydney. Just follow the Late Line hashtag. But first, our other headlines. Over and out. High-profile AFL chief Andrew Demetriou announces he'll step down at the end of the season. Freedom denied. Former health union boss Michael Williamson taken into custody as he awaits sentencing for fraud. And centre stage, Cate Blanchett wins an Oscar for Best Actress for her role in Woody Allen's Blue Jasmine.
So humiliating.
Qantas will be free to sell its domestic operations into majority foreign ownership under changes to be brought before Parliament by the end of the week. Repealing investment restrictions on Qantas was the most radical option before Cabinet as it met to discuss the national carrier's problems tonight. The Prime Minister accepts the move could see more jobs shift offshore, but he says it's in the long-term best interests of Qantas and for the Australian economy. Political correspondent Tom Eagleton has more from Canberra.
For 2 hours tonight, Cabinet thrashed around options for how best to address Qantas's recent financial problems.
It was a very full discussion. It canvassed all points of view, all perspectives. Every single member of the Cabinet spoke.
For months we've seen speculation, leaking, backgrounding by senior ministers against each other about what should happen with Qantas.
The government will look to repeal Part 3 of the Qantas Sale Act, the part that keeps Qantas in majority local ownership, as well as basing maintenance operations and headquarters in Australia. Another act means the international part of Qantas will remain in majority local ownership, but a major restructure now beckons for Qantas's domestic operations.
Under what we are proposing, Qantas International would remain, in every sense, an Australian airline. Qantas Domestic, should there be a distinction, would remain a substantially Australian airline.
It was the toughest approach open to Cabinet. A less confrontational option would have been to lift some foreign ownership restrictions but keep the airline overall in majority local hands. Legislation's expected to come before Parliament this week. The pressure is now on Labor to decide to pass or block the move in the Senate.
Isn't there a probability here that jobs could be moved offshore, and that's going to be the major stumbling block for Labor, isn't it? How are you going to get past that?
It's deeply regrettable whenever an Australian job goes offshore, but in the long run, the best way, indeed even in quite the short run as well, the best way to maximise good jobs in this country